is curious. I mean, we practice curiosity. It's true, but that's not exactly what I'm getting at either. What I mean when I say that Unitarian Universalism is curious is that we're kind of funny. Not like last week funny. That was hysterical, right? No, we're funny. We're curious, we're odd and peculiar because of our particular kind of hypocrisy, granted by our peculiar disposition and cultural positioning. To be sure, in this case, hypocrisy is not so much a condemnation as it turns out to be an opportunity. I'll describe it specifically in a bit, but for now, suffice it to say that in general, our values and principles give the impression that we are quite countercultural. And yet, in terms of general education, income, and wealth levels, and the underlying socioeconomic structures and norms that enable those levels, we are among the greatest beneficiaries of the cultural systems we often see ourselves as counter to. And that is curious. The fact is that we are, as Unitarian Universalists, not so much countercultural as we are early adopters. We tend to be on the leading edge of political and theological evolutions. Our ancestors were among the first religious traditions that dared to say that both belief in God and Jesus as his Son were optional. We were the first to ordain women ministers in America in 1863. We were the first to perform same-sex marriages in the 1980s in the midst of the AIDS crisis. And we are proudly populated with gay, queer, and transgender clergy and continue to be leaders of justice work fighting for the inclusion and rights of all marginalized people. And all of that is good work. It is life-saving work, but it is not countercultural. We are cultural pioneers, not countercultural revolutionaries. Now, give that the distinction there can be fuzzy at the margins, but at least in one instance, the distinction is clear. It is identified by the hypocrisy I mentioned earlier, and we'll explain in a moment, and it just happens to concern the fate of the most important thing that you can imagine. Incidentally, what's the most important thing that you can imagine? Imagine it. It probably flashed for you when I said it. So recall that. Do you have the image in your mind? So I'm just going to get my water. Jean-Marc, what's the most important thing that you can imagine?
Being born.
Being born. All right. Julie, what's the most important thing you can imagine?
Love.
Love. And it takes a person, or it takes a being to love. That's what's at stake. The system in which we live and on which we depend, the system of which we have been among the greatest beneficiaries, is not sustainable. And it is nearing collapse. You can see it in almost everywhere you look. from the environmental to the political to the social. And this is a system that is a natural outgrowth of a fundamental assumption. And that assumption is that we are individual beings, not the descendants of stars along with all we see or components of a whole trajectory, but independent things, discrete from one another, personas disjoined from other personas, sensory machines reactive to, but distinguished from a sensual world. In short, we perceive ourselves as separate. We assume that we are separate. My favorite contemporary philosopher, who you've heard me refer to a few times, Charles Eisenstein, identifies ours as an age or a story of separation. And that story makes all the difference. It is why we are here. When we see ourselves as separate entities in a world of separate entities, everything is other. The ecosystem, the animal, the soil, each other, even our own selves become estranged. And in that understanding, in a cosmos where one's self is fragile and isolated and alone, life becomes a zero-sum game. There are winners and there are losers, and no one wants to be a loser. Thus, the notion that we are separate gives rise to the sense of scarcity and the need for control, which in turn generates societal and personal systems of domination and oppression. Racism, patriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism. That's where we are living. And we have been for a millennia. This is the domination paradigm. To the systems generated by the story of separation, the world looks like a competitor or a commodity. You look like a competitor or a commodity. Your energy, body, and space are exploitable as labor or capital or a threat. And nature is treated the same, reduced from self-organizing systems, miracles, reduced from self-organizing systems that are generous and resilient to single-use systems that are defensive and fragile or hostile. So in the separation assumption, the story of separation, the domination paradigm, a forest is seen as floors waiting to be sold. To a hammer, the world looks like a nail, and pretty soon everything gets smashed. And our system is a hammer. This reduction is anti-life. It doesn't mean to be. It's not cruel on purpose. It just is the way it is. Commodification selects for single-use application, reductiveness, the denial of consciousness and spirit. I'll say that again. Commodification, what the story of separation produces, selects for single application, reductiveness, the denial of consciousness and spirit. Meanwhile, evolution, commodification is counter to evolution. Because evolution, the life force, selects for increasing complexity. From molecules from cells, for life from molecules, for consciousness from matter, and perhaps even for spirit. Speaking of denying the spirit, once upon a time, as many of you may know, I went to business school. Now that may light up the spirit of some folks, but not me. Anyway, two of the first things they taught us I knew intuitively were wrong. I didn't have the language to offer a counter-narrative to them, plus I was paying them a lot of money, so I didn't want them to be wrong, but they were, I think. One, that if you were the country that produced the best and most bananas, that you and only you should produce bananas and only bananas. I didn't know it then, but that was a recipe for fragility and an abdication of sovereignty. Any forest will tell you strength is in diversity. The other false lesson was that if you're not growing, you're dying. And that felt fatalistic and desperate even then. And it felt that way because that's exactly what it yields, death and desperation. There is obviously a limit to growth, particularly in terms of commodities and capital, and we are beginning to experience that limit even now. If the entire socioeconomic structure is predicated on growth, as ours is, when growth is no longer possible, it's a double whammy. For not only does it mean that the entire socioeconomic structure is about to fail, that's bad news, it means there are no more resources left. The growth or death model has consumed it all. Everything has been perceived as a nail. All nails have been hammered. There's no diversity, and the world fails. Obviously, this is a crisis that threatens our environment, but the solution is not environmentally based. It's not a technical solution, for the source of the problem is not environmental limits. The source of this problem is not that we live in a limited environment. The source of the problem is us. I don't mean that there's too many of us. Actually, more precisely, the source of the problem is me. And it's you. It is that we have been taught to think of ourselves as separate from one another and separate from the world, reducing the world and its inhabitants, including each other, to commodities, competitors, or threats. The problem, or the puzzle, is our identity. The puzzle is this: how do we transform our identities as discrete individuals in a world of other into identities that comprehend themselves as interdependent with all existence? How do we do that? How do we lay to rest the story of separation and the domination paradigm and live into the story of interbeing and develop a partnership paradigm? How do we cultivate inter-identities? When you see yourself as a complex entity made up of complex entities and enmeshed in a complex web of equally complex entities made up of their own complex entities, the particulars of which are beyond our comprehension. When we can see ourselves in that way, we will become a more graceful presence on this grace-granted planet. We will be more humble in our appetites, and our appetites will decrease, for appetite is often a function of scarcity. And scarcity is a function of the story of separation. We will feel more whole and less alone. We will live lives of greater depth and meaning and purpose, for the living of them will not be for us alone. Living itself will be understood as an act of kinship with all life, and even more with all the systems and programs that support life. We will know in our bones that all of this is one body. That we are human cells in one organ of that body called humanity, just one of a myriad of vital organs of our planet. And when we shift from the sense of separation to the sense of interbeing, our particular organ will cease devastating those organs around us, and the whole body may yet recover. When we see ourselves in each other's eyes, when we sense ourselves in each other's lives and the life all around us, we will know we are connected. And you know what connection feels like? You do. It feels like love. That's the vision. It's not a new vision. It's a wisdom you have known in your heart since you were a child. It's a wisdom that is inherent, a reflection or voice from that of us which bears the imprint of our inherent worth and dignity. And it's simply the way the world already is, a way that we have been living in opposition to for millennia. It's a vision attested to in our principles, the seventh one to be precise, the one about the interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part. And that is where the hypocrisy comes in. We who are in so many ways the privileged pinnacle of the system brought about by the story of separation and the domination paradigm do affirm and promote the interdependent web of existence. And of course, as it says in the preamble to the principles, and in true Unitarian fashion, we affirm it and we promote it. And if we leave it at that, we can kiss it goodbye. And whatever earlier was the most important thing that you could imagine, affirming and promoting will close its eyes forever too. We can affirm and promote until the water subsumes the earth, and it will not matter. Interdependence, interbeing cannot just be an idea. It must be an experience. The new assumption. The story in which we understand who we are and how we are to act. And it is our task to bring that experience about. That is our task. And I don't know how. It must be felt. It must be the way we see and think and understand. It must be an identity. Until then, all solutions will be band-aids that likely create further problems as they carry within them the source code of separation. Always looking for a solution to the problem, to the enemy, to the other. So how do we get from separation to wholeness? Maybe the first and most important response ought to be, I don't know. Humility is likely a necessary ingredient in this shift. That said, I have been applying some curiosity to a couple practices of late that I find at least help me to shift my perspective. And they're both sort of mantras. One is one that I think I've shared with you before. I call it the carbon rule, as distinct from the golden rule. What you do to others, you do to yourself. What you do to others, you do to yourself. And that's just an observation, right? Of course, that sort of collapses the category of other also. So maybe it should say, what you do, all that you do to yourself. The other is a little meditation game I play. At any time and in any place, I look to whatever is around me and I think, I am of thee, and you are of me. To a stranger, to a chair, to a cloud, I am of thee, and you are of me. To an animal, or a tree, to a car, to everything I see, to the air, to all that I hear. And one other thing, we can organize systems that seek to live into a partnership paradigm. Systems like the one in which you currently sit. So congratulations, you've taken the first step. And if you've been here for more than a minute, you know that it's only the first step. And will this save the world? Preserve what is at stake? I don't know. But it's a start. And we'll never get there if we don't start. And at least this way, the journey will be one of love. Interbeing recognizes that wholeness is not an isolating completion, but rather a sense of connection. Wholeness is connection, and connection feels like love. Understanding the world and all its inhabitants, not as commodities, but as beings of our heart, beautiful and deeply connected to our souls. I am of thee, you are of me, we are of each other. We can lean on one another. And that would be truly curious.